Chapter 12, Hunting 51, Grapehoe, the Offset Tiller, Inventions, Fruit Sizer. After being shifted from one place to another for several years after the fire in 51, Lauren Lee decided to buy 150 acres of land near Whitney, 20 miles from the east entrance of Algonquin Park. We had hunted 2 years east of Trout Creek from a log cabin owned by Tom Johnson. Lots of fun and a reasonable amount of success, but the fact that we were again being crowded out prompted Lauren to buy the land. Ellis Corman hunted with us his first time from Lauren's farm, and this is how he got his first deer. 3 inches of fresh snow made tracking very easy and almost gave the impression of being in a brand new world. We knew very little about our new area, so for the first few days the best we could do was wander about with no definite plan in mind except to explore. Shortly after noon, I found some real fresh tracks made by a doe and a fawn, and with nothing better to do, I decided to see where they went. For more than an hour, the deer led me over hill and dale in every direction on my compass. Then, to my surprise, just ahead of me, my private deer tracks were mingled with a man's footprints, which I decided could be made by Ellis. As there was no point in following further, I hunted the rest of the afternoon in another direction. Shortly after I reached the 10-acre open field surrounding the house we used for our camp, I noticed Ellis coming about 100 yards behind me. I had heard no shots fired during the whole afternoon, and yet here comes a very excited Ellis hauling a small deer. This is the incredible story he told me. He had followed a doe and a fawn for what seemed like miles when he came across what was left of an old wire fence. The doe took one side and the fawn took another. The fence was no more than 50 yards long and ended as abruptly as it started, and there seemed no reasonable excuse for it being in the middle of the bush. About halfway along the fence, the fawn decided to join its mother on the other side. Apparently, it misjudged the height and caught its neck between the top 2 strands of wire, and its momentum snapped a rather delicate neck. As Ellis approached cautiously, it was evident that the fawn was still alive, and it was hard for Ellis to understand why it was not off and running. Finally, as he stood beside the fawn, it seemed pointless to shoot a deer that was already dead, so we cleaned it and headed for camp. That evening in camp was one laugh after another as Ellis told and retold the crazy story. Most guys agreed that it would have been much more believable if he had put a bullet in the deer and claimed to have shot it on the run. Elmer Wilson called me off to the side and very privately asked, "Hey Cliff, now tell me what really happened." If you knew Ellis Corman as well as I know him, you would realize the story was told as accurately as he could remember. This was the first year after the fire, and I had replaced the 3 guns I had lost: a .22 rifle, a .38-55 Winchester, and an Ithaca 16-gauge shotgun, with a new 12-gauge Ithaca shotgun because I felt I could not afford to replace all 3. As there are no sights on a shotgun, there was great debate among us as to its use as a deer gun. It would seem reasonable that it would fall short in both accuracy and range, so to find out, I loaded the gun with slugs and fired 2 shots at a stump. The stump was about 3 feet in diameter, 4 feet tall, and well rotted in the center, and located in the middle of the open field behind the camp. Examination proved both slugs had found their mark not too far from the center, had gone right through and continued on several yards past. When we paced the distance back to the shooting position, it was nearly 150 yards. The gun seemed to be much more than adequate. About the 3rd day of the hunt, I was relaxing while I sat on a large log eating a chocolate bar, admiring the surroundings and trying to get used to the absolute lack of noise. The log was high enough to allow me to peer over the millions of raspberry canes before me and view everything up to 100 yards and within 180 degrees. Even farther, down the deer trail that ran right through the middle of the raspberry patch, the remains of an old logging road. The large hardwood trees, widely spaced, were the only restrictions to a perfect view of the whole area. In a few words, a beautiful spot. The noise I heard far to my left rapidly increased in volume, giving me plenty of time to pinpoint the direction. My first glimpse of the running fawn, as it cleared the top of the raspberry canes, indicated to me that that fawn intended to run directly across the whole area in front of me, but much too far out. When it cleared the canes the third time, I fired, believing it was now or never. I was close enough to a score to take some hide off its tail. He disappeared momentarily, and within seconds, he was coming directly towards me, down the old logging trail, just like the 410 Express. He could just as easily have gone directly away, giving me no chance at all, and it was hard to believe that he had made such a stupid choice. It would appear that nothing mattered except getting away from that sore tail. I had barely enough time to aim and fire before he ran me down. When he stopped sliding, he was no more than 30 feet in front of me and dead as a limp dish rag. When I got back to camp, I had nearly as much trouble as Ellis trying to get the man to believe my story. The only indication that I had hit the deer at all was a little scar on his tail and a 12-gauge hole in the exact center of a very small nose. Ira Lee was really not convinced until he skinned the neck down far enough to locate the slug that had shattered every vertebrae in the first 15 inches of his neck. This little episode thoroughly convinced me that his gun could shoot every bit as accurately as I can, and so I have used the same gun ever since. By the fall of 1952, having failed miserably to sell the patent rights to a manufacturer of either the Grapehoe or the Hole Digger, Frank Batters and I decided that the better way would be to have a model to display. I discussed the whole problem with Frank Ott, who was operating an independent welding shop of his own at the corner of number 8 and number 20 highways. Frank was an ambitious person with no knowledge of growing fruit, but definitely a genius as a welder and designer. He liked my idea, and we formed a partnership between the three of us, giving me 48% and each of the others 26% of both costs and profits. It took Frank Ott and I that winter, using all our spare time, to build a Grapehoe on my tractor, and we spent many sleepless nights wrestling with the numerous problems that came up. It was really a great experience. I knew exactly what was required, and he knew how to get it. Long before it was possible to get on the land to try our new machine in actual working conditions, we had it ready to go. In the gravel of his driveway in front of the welding shop, it worked like a charm, and it would seem that we had hit the jackpot. The first reasonable day of spring finally came, and we drove the tractor to the field. Within 15 minutes, we were both convinced that it was a total flop. It was difficult to get that thing to dig in the ground, and when we did, it refused to move towards or from the tractor. What a disappointment. It took about 3 years to see anything at all humorous about that situation. The only thing our year's efforts proved was that it would not work. We shelved the whole idea until fall. It taught us one valuable lesson. There is a lot of difference between theory and practice. By fall, we had both come up with new ideas, so we scrapped the first machine and started on an entirely new line of thought. We replaced the gears, sprockets, and rakes with 2 cone-type clutches and steel cables. Only after extensive tests and many changes, we were ready to try it in the field. The trial run was cause for celebration. A few minor changes and beef-ups, and our Fruitland offset tiller was ready for production. We decided to approach production rather cautiously, considering our limited finances and the fact that the average farmer may not be as skillful in operating the machine as myself. We decided on the conservative 10. The next problem, price. There are now 2 hand-operated machines and 2 power-driven machines on the market as competition. Undoubtedly, if we had started production when we first applied for the patent, we would have had an open field. Now, every sale made by the competition cut into an already limited sales potential, regardless of the fact that we considered our Tilly a little better. Frank Ott estimated our manufacturing costs would be about $100 each. If we could make $100 or more machines, which would allow us to retail at $250, almost $100 below our competitors. So, in order to get Tilly on the road and establish a reputation, we decided to sell the first 10 at $237, an extra enticement to a rather cautious group of buyers. We purposely picked every type of operator, from the over-careful to the ridiculously reckless, and we guaranteed each machine unconditionally for 1 year. It was also important to keep the sales local so that I could keep constant check on their success or problems. It turned out that it cost over $200 each to make the first 10 because they were practically handmade and it was impossible to get a reduced price on a small amount of materials required. We anticipated this situation and were pleased to come close to breaking even on the manufacturing costs alone. The costs for patents in Canada and US, advertising, blueprints, etc., were comparatively small compared to those of the next year when we had to tool up to really get into production. There were close to 110 different parts in each machine, and in order to have them interchangeable, it was necessary to make several costly manufacturing gigs to assure uniformity. I never worked harder in my life and enjoyed it more. The farm must have suffered somewhat to give me time to look after the problems of 10 new machines, make demonstrations, look up prospective dealers, and report back to my partners. Like every other machine, ours had some flaws. As I have said, we used 2 cone clutches, which transferred the necessary power from the power takeoff shaft built into most tractors to the transverse pipe assembly, which supported the Grapehoe blade, which did all the work. The pipe assembly was mounted midway between the front and rear wheels, extended to the right side a maximum of 30 inches past the outside of the rear wheel, and was capable of moving from that position 12 inches outside the rear wheel, in other words, a travel distance of 18 inches. This was great because that gave us about 4 inches more travel than our competitors, a good selling point. But, try as we would, there was no way we could stop the clutches from squealing when they were being engaged. You could hear every movement of the pipe assembly loud and clear from a distance of 100 yards. One buyer said this is not bad at all because he could tell when his man was taking time off. Another problem, although we used the very best aircraft type cables to pull the pipes in and out, some operators could wear out a set in less than 8 acres of grapehoeing. We had hoped for at least 20 acres. The system we used to lift the blade from the ground and control the working depth was unique in that it allowed the blade to float up and down or find the proper working depth according to how much pressure the operator applied to the leaf spring of the depth control lever. We pushed the blade from the rear axle of the tractor rather than pull it from the front axle, as all the others did, which gave us the advantage of partly eliminating the side draught created by the offset blade. However, this system also created a new set of rules in controlling the depth. Just as a stick that is pushed ahead of oneself has a tendency to dig too deep, so did the blade dig too deep if it were not properly adjusted. We copied the shape of the old horse-drawn Grapehoe blade, which was about 24 inches long, 9 inches high, and concave from top to bottom. The blade was adjustable to practically any position, and the big trick was to teach each new operator the new rules. Things went even better than we had hoped for. Even the poorest operator soon learned to operate Tilly with efficiency, and for me, each demonstration was another thrill. We were confident that we had made it, so the next step was to get dealers. I contacted Bert Beamer, manager of the tractor division of Lincoln Motors, the Ford dealer in St. Catharines. When he witnessed the job Tilly could do, he was almost as enthusiastic about it as I was, even though the demonstration was late in the summer, long past grapehoeing season. George Lounsbury, Frank Lee, and myself made a trip to the grapehoeing area of New York State, spent 2 days trying to get dealers there without success. It seemed a little odd to me because Frank Lee was already involved in a loose partnership with Murray Utter, selling the fact Grapehoe. He, nevertheless, gave me his full support. By the time I got around to asking Jerry Hansen, the Ferguson dealer in Stony Creek, it was late fall and the ground was frozen, impossible to demonstrate in the field. It was evident that Jerry was a doubting Thomas, so I asked his permission to put Tilly on one of his new tractors. When Tilly was ready and working just great, no amount of talking could convince him that this one could control the blade with any degree of accuracy. In front of the showrooms, there were 20 or more brand new tractors lined up nicely, side by side, in a single row. As I got on the tractor, I asked Jerry to come with me and watched how easily the blade was controlled. I started at one end of that line of new tractors and drove to the other end and manipulated the blade in and out, missing each new front tire by no more than 1/4 of an inch. Jerry followed closely, as it was fun to see him breathe in quickly as I passed another new tire. Thoroughly convinced, he agreed to be one of our dealers. I will have to admit it was a little risky, because a 1/4 inch mistake could have cost me a new tire, and a pretty fair dealer. The only other dealer was Mr. Cosby, the Ferguson dealer at Smithville. He was slightly out of the grape growing area and would make no commitment as to the quantity he might sell in a year, so his value to us was not that great. However, he did make about 6 sales and ordered each one as he sold it. He did an exceptionally good job of getting every application of work from easy going to the toughest sod in grapes, bushes, and trees. During that following winter, Bert Beamer put on a show at the shop to introduce the latest model Ford tractors. I was happy to accept an offer to show our movies. Frank's projector was a new thing to me, and with a minimum of instruction from Frank, I was set out to do the job. Before the show began, I had the movie set up to my satisfaction, and as the crowd increased, so did my nervousness. When it came to my turn, I started off by saying that these were only home-type movies made by amateurs, and my hope was that they were good enough to illustrate our Fruitland offset tiller. As I spoke, I started to roll the pictures. One glance at the screen told me the focus was good. Then, as I paid close attention to the projector, an unexpected questions started to come from all over the room. Who's the operator? What gear are you driving in? How many acres can you do in a day? Etc., etc. When I finally looked back at the screen, it was not hard to understand the reason for all the questions. Apparently, I had not remembered to change the speed control in the projector from the fast rewind speed to the proper speed for showing pictures. I was going down the row of grapes like you would never believe, and Tilly was jumping in and out at what seemed like 30 miles an hour, without hitting a vine or a post. No wonder they were curious. Apologies were in order, and I can assure you that I captured the attention of the entire audience, and the rest of the show went without interruption. It was some time later that we had the opportunity to show the same pictures with the same projector to the bigwigs of the Ford Tractor Division in Toronto. Bet your bottom dollar the speed was just right from the very beginning. I was never any good at speaking off the cuff in front of an audience, especially in front of important men, but this time my enthusiasm and pride of accomplishment outweighed all my fears. Frank Batters had made the appointment and was with me at the presentation, and when he complimented me on the job, I knew I had done it all right. We hoped to get the Ford people involved, but they considered the potential market was not big enough to merit their consideration. Spring found my finances even lower than usual, so I went to Walter Scott again for help from the Royal Bank. In no uncertain terms, he told me that I was a farmer, not a machinery manufacturer, and that I would no doubt lose whatever I invested. I knew his opinion was both friendly and honest, and all my arguments to change it were wasted. He knew how I detested being in debt, and he played that angle up rather well. I again explained that I was already committed and had signed an agreement with my partners, which I had no intention of trying to get out from under. I can still hear his mumbling, more to himself than me, as he signed the papers that granted the loan I had asked for. Walter Scott ranked highly among my friends for many years. It was always a great pleasure to sit in his office after he had returned from our annual hunting trips and relate all the happenings of the season, because it was so evident that he was keenly interested. He helped Bob slack financially, the same as he did for me, and whatever Bob and I were in the bank at the same time, he would usually call us into the office, and the greeting would go something like this: "Well, here is a bad pair to be together. You know, I'm not sure what business I am really in. Whether it is trucking, farming, or banking is just toss-up." On one occasion, when I was complaining bitterly about borrowing more money, he told me that I worried entirely too much about being in debt, that no one had ever made it big before he was in debt up to his ears. When it came time for Bart Beamer to display his implements at the big implement show held at the Coliseum in Toronto Exhibition Grounds, we were invited to include Tilly. Bert rigged up an electric motor to drive the PTO of the tractor on which Tilly was mounted, and we surely drew a lot of attention. The show was on for 3 days in February, and we made many contacts with prospective buyers. Spring comes to St. Catharines area almost 2 weeks ahead of ours, so Bert allowed one of his top salesmen, Bill Page, to devote most of his time to arranging demonstrations to small selected groups on one of their farms. Bill was a much older man and a dyed-in-the-wool implement salesman, and sold on Tilly. It was something else to arrive on the scene and be introduced to 6 or 8 total strangers, climb on a new tractor, and be expected to put on a flawless demonstration. Bill seemed to have more confidence in my ability than I had, because where I would have picked the easiest row to Grapehoe, he always picked the toughest. There could be 50 or 60 rows of grapes with not a weed nor a crooked vine, but Bill always managed to find at least one that had grass, weeds, crooked vines, broken posts, and everything that makes it awkward to do a good job. Then, privately, he would say, "Go ahead, Cliff, you can do it." He must have known what he was doing, because he made 6 sales out of a possible 8. That year, Lincoln Motors sold over 50 machines, and Bill and I were putting Grapehoes on tractors all over the Niagara district, any time between 6 in the morning and midnight. He even sold one to a farmer who had owned an International Orchard model tractor, onto which they both knew we could not fit our machine. When I asked him why he did that, he replied that the man liked our machine well enough to rent a Ford from Lincoln Motors to do his grapehoeing. Maintenance on Tilly was as simple as we could make it. All the bushings were the oil-impregnated type and were consequently lubricated for the life of the bushing. The clutch linings were twice as thick as they needed to be and gave excellent service. In other words, the only attention Tilly needed on a daily basis was to grease the pipe assembly. You would be amazed how many operators refused to do even that, in spite of the obvious fact that frequent greasing could easily triple the life of the cables by reducing the drag of dry pipes. We continued to sell Grapehoes with an ironclad guarantee for the first year, and we soon realized why the more experienced manufacturers put limits on theirs. Roy Masterson of St. Catharines brought a pipe assembly back to us that was bent out of shape so badly that it was hardly recognizable. We replaced it free of charge, but both Frank Ott and myself realized that it was impossible to get them in that shape with normal use. We found out later that Roy's man ran into a heavy end post while traveling down the lane in higher gear. Even if the tractor had been the average size instead of a big Oliver, the results would have been the same. One day in May, as I was driving by Philip Green's farm, located on the top of the escarpment directly south of Stony Creek, a large group of parked cars prompted me to investigate. We had sold a machine to him and George Andrews to share between them, so I was more than surprised to find Murray Utter demonstrating the latest model fact hydraulic Grapehoe, mounted on the latest model International tractor. Even more surprising, he was running the new fact in direct competition with our Tilly, which was on a much smaller 5-year-old Ferguson tractor. Murray was driving the fact, and Harry Sparrow, the poorest, roughest, most irresponsible driver in the whole area, was making an awful mess of driving Tilly. It took a real effort to keep my cool, and when I finally got talking to Murray, I calmly suggested that if he wanted a contest, I would be willing to operate our machine. With several men standing around listening intently to a rather intense situation, Murray had no choice, and the race was on. My examination of Tilly proved the blade was as dull as the proverbial hoe and a mile out of adjustment. Fortunately, Phil had a better blade at the barn, so I held up the whole show while he brought it to me and I installed it in the proper position. Luckily, this allowed me a little cooling off period, and I just now realized that the Ferguson was in rather poor shape and that I had never driven one of this model in the field before. Even the gears were different. How I would have loved to have my own tractor. We started at the same time, each on its own row, and the hard clay soil, as dry as it was, rolled away very nicely. The rows were about 300 feet long, and it was my good fortune to make only one mistake that required me to stop, back up, and then go ahead again. Murray was not that lucky because I beat him back to the place of beginning by 60 feet. His disappointment in the outcome of the race was quite evident that he was pretty quick to suggest that Tilly would not do so well in sod. The only thing I could say was, "Let's find out." We went over to the adjoining orchard of prune plums that had been in the sod for several years, and we again took our own rows. That poor little Ferguson went the whole length of the row at a 45-degree angle. It was just too tough. Murray beat me by a country mile, but I think most of those present realized the fault was with the weight of the tractor, not the efficiency of Tilly. One thing is for sure, that little demonstration did us no harm. That same summer was the beginning of extensive tests of chemical weed killers, which was eventually to eliminate the necessity of grape hoeing, and, as I have mentioned before, it was unfortunate that we did not begin Tilly's development 6 years earlier. It is also reasonable to assume that if we had worked on the hole digger at the very beginning, our chances of success would have been vastly better. We were not smart enough to realize that the market for Tilly was restricted to the Niagara Peninsula, while any farm in Canada or US was a prospective user of a machine which would dig holes for planting trees or posts. For many years, those producing hole diggers, and there were many, did so without the protection of a patent, because of the one granted to me. That fall left us with about 25 complete machines not sold, plus mounting brackets for 200 more. We concluded, taking all things into consideration, that we were wiser to quit. The Fruitland Tiller Co. finally showed a net loss of nearly $10,000, half of which was mine. To sum up, if you consider the hundreds of gratifying episodes not reported here, the new friends I made during this period, and the immense pride of accomplishment I derived, perhaps the price I paid was not too great. I would be foolish to say that I was not disappointed in the financial results, but it was a great comfort to know that his had no bearing on the actual success of the machine. I should have mentioned that during our first year I had the brilliant idea that a rototiller mounted in place of the blade might solve the problem of excessive hard ground and or sod. The 3.5 horsepower gasoline engine drove a horizontal 10-inch round plate which had 3-inch spikes welded to its outer edge, pointing downward. We used the rear end assembly from a job foreign car for the driving gears, and the whole thing was only a cobbled up job, just to prove whether the idea was worth development. It was just moderately successful. We anticipated using the PTO of the tractor and streamlining the whole thing, but decided the selling price of the finished product would be too high for the amount of advantage derived over the standard blade. So I have one-of-a-kind rotary power-driven Grapehoe stashed in the barn. It would seem that I was forever dreaming up ideas, but my finances demanded that the only ones I attempted to develop were those which could serve a useful purpose. The subsoiler I had built worked just fine, but not as well as the ones made by an implement manufacturer some time later. The trench digger was a decided failure, mainly because the little Ford Ferguson was not enough tractor to handle the job. With the larger 3000 Ford diesel I owned later, the results may have been different. My idea was to dig about 6 inches of soil with each trip down the proposed trench, making as many passes as was required to attain the desired depth. I made the digging part first, intending to come up with a device that could take the loose dirt out of the trench later. It turned out that the first 2 passes were reasonably good, but from there on down, the ground was much harder and just too big a job, so I never tried to work out the device for removing the loose dirt. A more successful attempt at Inventions was the fruit sizer. There are many kinds of graders already on the market, each with serious restrictions or definite faults. Bartlett and Beansville made a machine which consisted of 2 flat belts that ran horizontally for a distance of 8 or 10 feet. The fruit was fed on the belts at one end, and as the space between the 2 belts, which was adjustable, grew larger, the fruit dropped through onto a padded tray. By dividing the tray into sections, each section contained the same size fruit. This system was fast and about 80% accurate. For grading pears, it was hard to beat. Unfortunately, it was a little tough on the more tender fruit, such as peaches, and less than 40% accurate on apples, which measured much smaller from blossom end to stem end than the cross diameter. Plums, as long as they were round and firm, would grade successfully, but if shaped like a prune, they would turn the wrong way and carry past the proper bin for their size. There were elaborate machines that graded by weight, expensive and too slow for smaller fruits. In other words, if a grower grew many varieties of fruit, it was necessary to own more than one sizing machine. Expensive and space-consuming in the packing shed. My hope was to come up with a compact, collapsible machine which would grade all varieties equally as well. It was right after the first Grapehoe failed so miserably that I presented my idea to Frank Ott and solicited his help to make a working model. Regardless of how good it looked on paper, I had learned from the Grapehoe not to be too confident about the outcome. The ever-present financial problem prompted me to use whatever was available which would serve the purpose, so this is how it went. We cut a 4 foot by 4 foot by 3/4 inch plywood to the largest circle possible. Around the outside edge, we cut a series of holes spaced as closely as possible and still retained strength. The side of the hole towards the center was cut round, and the side towards the outside was cut square, with the point towards the edge of the plywood. The holes were 3 inches wide. Under each hole we fastened thin steel plates which had the outside edge cut to form a square with the point towards the center of the plywood. The plates were welded to small rods which were made to recede towards the center of the plywood as the whole thing rotated. The net result was a square hole that started small and enlarged as the plywood wheels turned, the next best thing to an enlarging round hole. We mounted this mechanism horizontally on an old front-end car axle, and on the end of each rod a roller skate wheel ran against a programmed eccentric. I used a motor and a gearbox from an old washing machine to supply the power. The wringer drove the plywood wheel and the washer pulley drove the flat belt, which fed the apple up onto the plywood wheel. I think I bought every spare roller skate wheel that was for sale in the city of Hamilton. The 4 padded bins were fastened to receive apples and covered about half of the circumference of the wheel. I applied for a patent in both Canada and the US when we found out how well it worked. With a crew of 5 people, it would grade about a bushel of apples per minute and 99% accurately, with little or no damage to the fruit. The only part not satisfactory was the belt arrangement, which delivered the apples to the wheel. Timing the belt to the same speed as the wheel was rather easy, but I never did find out how to ration out only 1 apple to each hole, so the 5th person was required to do the tedious job of removing the extra apples from the wheel, which should have been unnecessary. If this rationing problem could have been resolved, theoretically at least, we could have speeded up the machines to double the time and consequently double capacity. By the time the patent for the U.S. had been granted, our experience with Tilly had proved that not all good ideas would pay off. So, rather than invest more money, we refused to pay the $125, which would have given me a patent in Canada also. The washing machine gears and roller skate wheels have graded thousands of bushels of apples gently and accurately, right up to 1972, and are still waiting for someone to turn on the switch. End of chapter 12.